When my son's wife thought I was just a penniless retired man with absolutely nothing to my name, it was a good thing I stayed quiet. Because 18 months later, she showed up at my front door with her slick father and a property transfer contract ready to kick me out into the street. But the smirk completely fell off her face when she finally saw the name on the building's deed. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled her perfect little world, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect should be earned, not bought. My name is Jack Callahan, and I am 70 years old. I live a quiet life in a modest, paid-off suburban home at the end of a cul-de-sac. I drive a 12-year-old truck that still runs like a dream because I take care of it myself. Most days you will find me in a worn-out flannel shirt and faded jeans drinking black coffee on my front porch. To anyone looking from the outside, I am just another retired old man living on a fixed income counting pennies to make it through the month. And for a long time, that was exactly what I wanted people to think. I raised my son, Aaron, to understand the value of a hard day's work. It was just the two of us for a long time, and I made sure he knew that nothing in this world is handed to you on a silver platter. He was a good kid, grounded and humble. But then he moved to the city and met Vanessa. Vanessa was a woman who measured a person's worth by the logo on their handbag and the zip code they lived in. She was obsessed with appearances status and making sure everyone knew she was better than them. When Aaron first brought her home to meet me, I could see the disappointment radiating off her. She stepped out of Aaron's leased luxury sedan, wearing shoes that probably cost more than my first car. She took one look at my gravel driveway, my old truck, and the peeling paint on my front porch, and her smile completely vanished. She offered me a limp handshake, barely making eye contact, before stepping into my house as if she were walking through a hazardous waste zone. I did not say a word. I just watched. A man learns a lot more by keeping his mouth shut and his eyes open. Over the next year, Vanessa made it her personal mission to treat me with thinly veiled condescension. Whenever they came over for Sunday dinner, which was rare because she always claimed to be too busy with her social calendar, she made sure to point out my shortcomings. I remember one specific evening I spent 4 hours slow roasting a beef chuck with potatoes and carrots, a meal Aaron used to love when he was a boy. When I set the plate down in front of her, Vanessa literally pushed it away with the tip of her manicured finger. She sighed dramatically and said she was on a strict organic diet and could not possibly consume all that sodium and fat. She then proceeded to pull a small container of kale salad from her designer bag, eating it while complaining about the draft in my old living room. Aaron just sat there looking at his plate, refusing to intervene. Her insults were never screaming matches. They were subtle, poisonous little jabs. She would ask if my heating bill was too high and offer to buy me a space heater out of pity. She would look at my flannel shirts and ask Aaron if they should take me to a charity clothing drive to get me something presentable for their wedding. Every time she spoke to me, she used that slow, loud voice people use when they think they are dealing with a senile old fool. I let her do it. I let her sneer at my 12-year-old truck when I parked it next to her shiny SUV. I let her roll her eyes when I offered to fix their leaky faucet instead of hiring an expensive contractor. I stayed perfectly silent, absorbing every insult and every pitiful glance. Because what Vanessa did not know, what even my own son Aaron did not fully understand, was the reality of my bank accounts. I chose to live simply because I liked it, not because I had to. But I wanted to see her true character, and she was putting it on full display. The illusion of their perfect life shattered on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Aaron had asked me to come over to their house while they were at work to fix a broken pipe under their kitchen sink. I let myself in with the spare key and got to work. Vanessa's house looked like a magazine cover filled with expensive modern art white leather sofas and crystal chandeliers. While I was under the sink tightening a valve, I reached up onto the counter to grab a wrench. My hand brushed against a stack of mail that had been carelessly tossed aside. A heavy red envelope fell to the floor, landing face up. The bold letters on the front caught my eye immediately. Final notice of default. I am not a man who snoops, but it was addressed to Aaron, and the word default sent a cold shiver down my spine. I picked it up and the paper practically unfolded itself. It was from a major credit card company demanding immediate payment of over $35,000. Underneath it was a notice from an auto loan company threatening to repossess Aaron's car. I left the mail on the counter, packed up my tools, and waited. When Aaron came home a few hours later, he looked exhausted. The kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from carrying a weight you can no longer support. I did not beat around the bush. I pointed to the red envelope on the counter and asked him what was going on. Aaron froze. The color drained completely from his face. He tried to laugh it off, claiming it was a clerical error, a mix-up with the bank. But I just stared at him, holding my ground. I told him he could not lie to me. That is when my son broke down. He collapsed onto one of those expensive white leather bar stools and buried his face in his hands. He started sobbing, the heavy, desperate tears of a man who has lost control. He confessed everything. He was drowning in over $100,000 of debt. Vanessa demanded a lifestyle he could not afford. The luxury vacations, the designer clothes, the five-star dinners. He had financed all of it on credit cards and personal loans because he was terrified she would leave him if she knew he was just a regular guy with a regular salary. But the worst part, the part that made my blood run cold, came next. I asked him how he was hiding this massive hole in their finances from his own wife. Aaron looked up at me, his eyes red and filled with shame. He admitted that Vanessa had noticed the missing money from their joint accounts. To cover his tracks, to explain why his paychecks were vanishing, he told her a lie. He told Vanessa that I was severely ill. He told her I had an expensive chronic medical condition and that my meager retirement could not cover the treatments. He told his wife that he was secretly funneling thousands of dollars a month to pay for my medical bills to keep me alive. I stood there in their pristine kitchen, letting the magnitude of his cowardice wash over me. My own son had used me as a scapegoat to fund his wife's vanity. He had painted me not just as a broke old man, but as a financial parasite draining their future. Aaron fell to his knees right there on the hardwood floor. He begged me. He grabbed my calloused hands and pleaded with me not to tell Vanessa the truth. He said if she found out he was broke and in debt, she would divorce him immediately and take everything. He begged me to play along, to pretend I was sick and penniless just until he could figure a way out of the mess. I looked down at the boy I had raised. I felt a deep, twisting disappointment in my chest. I knew I should have marched out that door and let his house of cards collapse. But he was my son, and despite my better judgment, despite the glaring disrespect I knew it would invite from Vanessa, I slowly nodded my head. I agreed to play the broke, sick old man. I agreed to shoulder the blame. But as I walked out to my old truck that afternoon, a quiet resolve settled in my bones. I would play the part they gave me, but I would not be a victim. I would watch, I would wait, and I would see exactly how far Vanessa would go now that she believed I was the reason for her financial inconveniences. The trap was set, and they were the ones handing me the bait. The agreement I made with my son felt like a rotting weight in my chest. I had built a life on honor. When I started my logistics company 40 years ago with nothing but a single delivery truck and a map, my word was my bond. I paid my drivers on time. I looked my clients in the eye. I never hid behind excuses. Now, in the final chapters of my life, I was hiding behind a fabricated medical crisis to protect a boy who lacked the spine to tell his wife the truth. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but I swallowed it because I needed to see exactly who Vanessa was when she felt she had all the power. Power does not change people. It simply reveals them. And the power of believing she was my financial savior revealed a monster. It started slowly. The subtle jabs at my clothes or my old truck turned into open hostility. A few weeks after my confrontation with Aaron, they invited me over for a Sunday lunch. It was a rare invitation, and I knew Aaron had likely begged her to extend it. I arrived early and sat at their expensive glass dining table. Vanessa walked into the kitchen holding a stack of bills. She slammed them down on the counter right in front of me. She did not say, she just looked at my old work boots, then up to my face and let out a loud theatrical sigh. She asked me if I had any idea how much physical therapy and specialist co-pays cost these days. I looked at her calmly and said I imagined they were quite expensive. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She told me I did not have to imagine because her husband was draining their savings to keep me breathing. She crossed her arms and stared me down, telling me that because of my failing health, they had to cancel a 2-week vacation to the Bahamas. She said it was incredibly selfish of me to expect a young couple to sacrifice their prime years to fund the inevitable decline of an old man who did not plan for his retirement. I sat there, listening to this woman berate me for draining money I had never touched. Aaron walked into the kitchen right as she was finishing her tirade. He froze. He looked at me, his eyes wide with sheer panic, silently begging me not to blow his cover. I looked at my son, a man I had taught to stand tall, shrinking into the corner of his own kitchen. I turned my gaze back to Vanessa. I told her I was sorry my health was such an inconvenience to her island vacation. She rolled her eyes, grabbed her keys, and walked out the front door, shouting over her shoulder that she was going to a spa to relieve the stress my very existence caused her. Once the door clicked shut, Aaron rushed over to me, apologizing profusely. He said she was just stressed. He said she did not mean it. I stopped him. I told him people always mean exactly what they say when they are angry. I told him he was building his marriage on a foundation of sand and lies, and that eventually the tide was going to come in. He just kept apologizing, offering me a glass of water, trying to sweep the ugliness under the rug. I did not drink the water. I got up, walked out to my truck, and drove back to my quiet, paid-off home. That was the last time I set foot in their house. Vanessa made sure of it. The cruelty escalated from passive-aggressive complaints to a deliberate campaign of exclusion. A month later, my 70th birthday rolled around. For the past 10 years, Aaron and I had a tradition of grabbing a steak at a local diner to celebrate. It was nothing fancy, just a good meal and a chance to catch up. The morning of my birthday, my phone rang. It was not Aaron. It was Vanessa. Her voice was ice cold. She did not wish me a happy birthday. She got straight to the point. She told me Aaron was not coming to see me. She said they were reviewing their finances and realized they could not afford to waste money on expensive steak dinners when they were already drowning in my medical debts. She told me she had taken control of Aaron's bank accounts to stop the bleeding. She said she was putting an end to the charity. I listened to her venomous tone, keeping my own voice perfectly level. I asked her if Aaron was there. I asked if my son had the courage to cancel on me himself. Vanessa laughed. A harsh, cruel sound that echoed through the phone. She told me Aaron was too guilty to do it, which is why she was stepping up to be the bad guy. She said someone had to protect their future because I was clearly content to drag them down into the grave with me. Then she delivered the final blow. She told me I was banned from their property. She said my presence was a constant, depressing reminder of the financial burden ruining her life. She explicitly stated that until I could pay them back for every single dime Aaron had supposedly spent on my phantom treatments, I was not welcome in her home, at her table, or in her life. She told me to figure out my own problems, maybe go on government assistance and leave them alone. Then she hung up. I set the phone down on my kitchen counter. The silence in my house was absolute. A normal father might have been crushed. A normal father might have broken down and called his son screaming the truth, demanding respect. But I am not a normal father. I built a multi-million-dollar logistics empire by knowing exactly when to let a competitor overextend themselves. Vanessa was overextending herself. She felt invincible because she believed she held all the financial cards. She believed I was a helpless, destitute old fool who would just wither away in the shadows. I walked into my home office. It is a small room paneled in cheap wood with a squeaky desk chair. It looks like the office of a man who clips coupons. I opened the bottom drawer of the desk and pulled out a thick leather binder. Inside were the quarterly statements from my blind trust. $18 million carefully managed, generating more interest in a month than Vanessa and Aaron made in a year. I looked at the numbers, verifying that my wealth was quiet, secure, and entirely invisible to the woman who had just banished me from my son's life. Later that evening, Aaron finally called. He sounded like a beaten dog. He stumbled over his words, trying to explain why he could not make it to my birthday dinner. He said work was crazy. He said his car had a flat tire. He lied to my face, totally unaware that his wife had already called to deliver the executioner's blow. I let him spin his web of pathetic excuses for a few minutes. I did not raise my voice. I did not mention Vanessa's call. I just listened to the sound of a man completely broken by his own deception. When he finally ran out of breath, I spoke softly. I told him I understood. I told him it was perfectly fine that he could not make it, and that he should focus on his wife. Aaron sounded incredibly relieved, thanking me over and over for being so understanding. He told me he would make it up to me. He promised we would get together soon. I told him not to worry about it. I told him I had a feeling we would be seeing each other very soon under very different circumstances. He did not catch the weight of my words. He was too consumed by his own survival to realize the ground was shifting beneath his feet. He hung up the phone, believing he had bought himself another month of peace. He believed his secret was safe. He believed Vanessa was satisfied, but Vanessa was not satisfied. Cutting me off was not enough for her. She did not just want to isolate me. She wanted to eradicate the problem entirely. She wanted to make sure I could never ask them for a single favor ever again. She believed I was sitting in my modest home, desperate, sick, and running out of options. She saw my supposed vulnerability as a green light to take total control. She was no longer content with just banning me from her life. She wanted to wipe me off the board completely, and that is when she made the biggest mistake of her life. That is when she decided it was time to bring her father Leonard into the picture to deal with my meager assets. She thought she was calling in the wolves to pick over the bones of a dying man. She had no idea she was actually walking straight into a trap I was quietly building right under her designer shoes. The isolation she forced on me was exactly what I needed. It gave me the quiet time to prepare to hire the right people and to wait for her to cross the line from disrespect to outright theft. I sat on my porch that night, drinking my black coffee, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The storm was coming, but I was not the one who was going to get wet. The silence that followed Vanessa's phone call lasted for 3 entire weeks. For 21 days, my phone did not ring. My driveway remained empty. Aaron did not reach out to check on me. I spent my mornings tending to my garden and my evenings sitting on the front porch, listening to the neighborhood settle into the night. It was a peaceful time, but it was the kind of peace you feel when the air pressure drops right before a hurricane. I knew Vanessa was not finished. A woman who builds her entire identity on control cannot simply walk away when she thinks someone owes her money. She needed to feel she had won. She needed to extract a pound of flesh. That pound of flesh arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the form of a shiny silver sports car that looked entirely out of place on my quiet suburban street. I was sitting in my worn armchair near the front window reading the morning paper when the vehicle pulled into my gravel driveway. The engine roared obnoxiously loud before finally shutting off. The man who stepped out of the driver's seat was someone I recognized immediately from the wedding photos, though we had only spoken briefly at the reception. It was Leonard Pierce, Vanessa's father. Leonard was a man who worked very hard to look 10 years younger and 10 times wealthier than he actually was. He wore a tailored navy blue suit that was a bit too tight around his waist. His hair was slicked back with an unnatural shine, and his skin carried that strange orange tint of a spray-on tan. Leonard was a real estate flipper. He bought distressed properties from desperate people, slapped a coat of cheap paint on the walls, and sold them at a massive markup. I always knew what kind of man he was, but seeing him strut up my walkway with a leather briefcase swinging at his side confirmed every suspicion I ever had. I walked to the front door and opened it before he could knock. I immediately hunched my shoulders, letting my posture drop. I made my hands tremble just a fraction of an inch as I pulled the door open. I widened my eyes, trying to look like a man who was deeply confused and overwhelmed by an unexpected visitor. Leonard flashed a bright, perfectly white smile that completely failed to reach his cold, dark eyes. He greeted me with loud, forced enthusiasm, clapping his hand onto my shoulder and squeezing it tight. He invited himself inside without waiting for me to offer, pushing past me into the narrow hallway. The smell of his expensive, heavy cologne immediately filled my modest living room, masking the scent of the pine cleaner I used on the floors. He walked around the space, slowly looking at the faded wallpaper, the old brick fireplace, and the simple wooden furniture. He did not look at my home the way a guest looks at a home. He looked at it the way a vulture looks at a wounded animal. I was calculating square footage, assessing structural integrity, and estimating profit margins right in front of my face. I offered him a cup of coffee. I shuffled into the kitchen, dragging my feet slightly, playing the part of the fragile senior to absolute perfection. When I returned with 2 steaming mugs, Leonard had already made himself comfortable at my dining table. He had opened his leather briefcase and spread a stack of thick legal documents across the worn oak surface. Leonard took a sip of his coffee and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of deep artificial sympathy. He told me he was here because he cared about our family. He said Vanessa and Aaron were completely falling apart under the weight of my medical bills. He claimed his daughter was crying herself to sleep every single night, terrified of the massive debt they were accumulating just to keep me alive. I sat across from him, holding my mug with 2 shaking hands. I lowered my gaze to the table as though the shame was simply too much to bear. I told him I was so sorry. I whispered that I never wanted to be a burden on my son. I let my voice crack, perfectly timing the emotion. Leonard seized the opportunity instantly. He reached across the table and patted my trembling hand. He told me he understood completely. He said aging is a difficult, terrifying process, and the American healthcare system is designed to bankrupt good, honest people. He fed on my fake vulnerability like a parasite. He told me I was a good father for worrying about Aaron, and that he was here to offer a lifeline. Then he laid out his trap. Leonard leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, looking at me with intense, predatory focus. He explained that medical debt collectors are ruthless. He spun a terrifying tale about government agencies and hospital lawyers coming after my assets. He told me that because Aaron was supposedly paying for my treatments, the debt collectors could legally seize my house. He painted a vivid, horrific picture of the authorities putting a padlock on my front door and throwing me out into the street, leaving me homeless and sick in my final days. He said if that happened, Aaron and Vanessa would be financially destroyed forever. I widened my eyes and let out a small, breathless gasp. I asked him what I could possibly do. I asked him how I could save my son from ruin. Leonard smiled. It was the smile of a man who believes he has just won the lottery. He pulled a thick document from the center of the pile and spun it around so it faced me. The bold letters at the top read Irrevocable Deed of Transfer. I explained his master plan in a smooth, practiced rhythm. He told me that as an experienced real estate investor, he knew how to build a fiduciary shield. He said the only way to protect my home from the aggressive debt collectors was to remove my name from the property title entirely. He proposed that I sign the deed of the house over to a private holding company controlled by him. Leonard promised me that nothing would change. He swore on his life that I could continue living to the house rent-free for as long as I needed. He framed the entire transaction as a massive personal favor. He acted as though he was taking on a huge legal risk just to protect an old man from the government. He said once the house belonged to his company, the hospitals could not touch it, and Aaron would be free from the crushing anxiety of losing his inheritance. I sat there staring at the legal document. Inside my mind, my thoughts were sharp, cold, and clear. I knew exactly what this snake was doing. This was not about medical debt, because there was no medical debt. This was about the ground beneath our feet. My quiet, modest home sits on 3 acres of land. What Leonard knew and what he assumed I was too old and stupid to realize was that the city council had quietly rezoned this entire suburban corridor just 2 months ago. This land was no longer just a residential lot. It was now zoned for high-density commercial development. The dirt beneath my old truck was suddenly worth millions of dollars to corporate developers. Leonard had done his research. He knew the gold mine sitting under my house, and he was using his daughter's cruel lie to steal it from me for absolutely nothing. I looked up at Leonard. I let a tear form in the corner of my eye. I asked him if he really thought this was the only way to save Aaron. I asked him if signing this paper would finally make Vanessa stop hating me. Leonard nodded solemnly. He told me this was the ultimate act of a loving father. He said Vanessa would finally respect me once she saw I was willing to sacrifice my pride to protect their financial future. He pulled a heavy gold pen from his jacket pocket and placed it gently on top of the contract. He told me to take my time and look it over, but stressed that the debt collectors were moving fast and we needed to act within the week. I picked up the pen with a shaking hand. I hovered the tip over the signature line. Leonard held his... I could literally see the greed expanding his pupils. He was practically vibrating with excitement. Then I put the pen down. I let out a heavy, dramatic sigh and told him my eyes were too tired to read the small print today. I told him I needed to sleep on it and asked if he could leave the papers with me. I promised I would look them over with a fresh pair of glasses in the morning and call him when I was ready to sign. The disappointment on Leonard's face was instantaneous, but he quickly covered it with another bright plastic smile. He did not want to push too hard and scare his prey away. He told me that was perfectly fine. He patted my shoulder again, standing up and smoothing his tight suit jacket. He told me to take the night to think about my son's future and promised he would answer my call the moment I was ready. I walked him to the front door, keeping my shoulders hunched and my steps slow. I thanked him profusely for being such a good friend to our family. Leonard chuckled, a rich, deep sound of absolute arrogance. He told me that family always protects family. He stepped out onto the porch, walked to his silver sports car, and drove away without looking back. I stood in the open doorway and watched his car disappear around the corner. I waited until the sound of the engine completely faded into the distance. Then I closed the front door and locked the deadbolt. I dropped the fragile old man act instantly. My shoulders straightened, my hands stopped shaking. The air in my lungs felt clear and sharp. I walked back into the dining room and picked up the contract Leonard had left behind. I read through the legal jargon confirming exactly what I already knew. It was a predatory contract designed to strip me of all my rights and hand complete ownership of my property over to his shell company. They did not just want to banish me from their lives. They wanted to rob me blind and leave me with absolutely nothing. Vanessa and Aaron had started this game with a pathetic lie to save face. But Vanessa and Leonard had just escalated it to outright theft. They thought they were circling a dying animal. They had no idea they were stepping into the cage of a man who had built an empire from nothing. I took the contract and carried it into my home office. I sat down in my squeaky desk chair and picked up my phone. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to let the wolves find out what happens when you corner the wrong man. I dialed the number of the most ruthless corporate attorney I knew. The real game was about to begin. The phone rang twice before a sharp and familiar voice answered on the other end. It was Oliver Stanton. Oliver was not the kind of lawyer you called when you needed to draft a simple will or dispute a parking ticket. He was a corporate shark. He was the man you called when you needed to dismantle a hostile takeover or bury a predatory competitor under a mountain of inescapable legal consequences. I had known Oliver for more than 2 decades, and he was one of the few people on this earth who knew the absolute truth about my financial reality. I sat back in my squeaky desk chair and looked out the window at my overgrown backyard. I told Oliver that we had a situation. I explained that a man named Leonard Pierce had just walked out of my house after trying to manipulate me into signing over the deed to my property. I told him about the irrevocable trust document and the fake medical debt story. I could hear Oliver typing furiously on his keyboard. He did not ask me if I was all right, because he knew I was not a victim. He simply asked me what I wanted him to do. I told him I wanted everything he could find on Leonard Pierce. I wanted to know his credit score. I wanted to know the status of his commercial loans. I wanted to know every single business he was involved in, and every bank that was currently keeping his real estate flipping company afloat. I told Oliver to follow the money and to spare absolutely no expense. I wanted a complete financial autopsy on Leonard's life before the end of the week. Oliver told me he would have a preliminary report on my desk by tomorrow morning. He asked me if I was finally ready to drop the act and show my family exactly who they were messing with. I told him the act was over. I told him the trap was set, and I was just waiting for them to walk far enough inside so that the door would lock behind them. I hung up the phone and took a deep breath, letting the silence of the house wash over me. It was time to face the truth about why I was really sitting in this small wood-paneled office, pretending to be a broke and fragile old man. The truth was that I had not worried about money for a single day in the past 10 years. When I was younger, I started a small delivery service with one used truck and a map. I drove through blizzards and heat waves, sleeping in the cab of my truck to save money on motels. I worked 18-hour days to build a regional logistics company from the ground up. 10 years ago, a major national shipping conglomerate made an offer to buy my company. They wanted my routes, they wanted my fleet, and they wanted my contracts. I sold my life's work for $18 million. It was a massive sum of money, but I did not go out and buy a mansion or a yacht. I placed the entire fortune into a secure blind trust managed by the best financial advisors in the state. I made sure the money generated passive income while remaining completely invisible to anyone running a basic background check. I stayed in my modest suburban house because it was my home. It was where I had raised Aaron. It was where I had taught him how to ride a bicycle in the driveway. I did not want to lose my connection to the real world. I did not want wealth to corrupt my soul or ruin my son. Aaron knew I had a comfortable retirement, but he had absolutely no idea about the blind trust or the $18 million. He thought I was just a retired truck driver living off a standard pension. But the money in the bank was only one part of the equation. The real reason Leonard and Vanessa were circling me like hungry vultures had nothing to do with my bank accounts. They were after the dirt beneath my feet. My quiet, unassuming house sits right in the middle of 3 sprawling acres of land. For decades, this area was zoned strictly for low-density residential housing. It was a quiet neighborhood with large lots and tall trees. But cities grow, and developers are always looking for the next big opportunity. Over the past year, I had been quietly attending city council meetings. I watched as commercial developers lobbied the local government to rezone our entire suburban corridor. 2 months ago, the city council approved the measure behind closed doors. My 3 acres of land were officially rezoned for high-density commercial development. The value of my property skyrocketed overnight. The soil under my 12-year-old truck was suddenly worth millions of dollars to any corporate developer looking to build a massive retail complex. The quiet residential lot was gone, and in its place was a commercial goldmine. I sat at my desk and pieced the puzzle together. Vanessa was a woman obsessed with status and wealth. She was the kind of person who constantly scoured public records to measure the net worth of her neighbors. She must have seen the rezoning approval in the public city registry. She must have realized that the supposedly broke old man she despised was actually sitting on a literal fortune in commercial real estate. She knew Aaron was completely ignorant about the true value of the land. She knew Aaron was terrified of his own shadow and too consumed by his credit card debt to pay attention to city zoning laws. And most importantly, she knew that I was a lonely old man with no other family. Vanessa did not hate me because I was a financial burden. She knew perfectly well that I was not costing them a single dime. The entire story about my expensive medical treatments was a lie that Aaron invented to cover his reckless spending. Vanessa simply used that lie to her advantage. She weaponized her husband's cowardice to create a fake crisis. She brought her father into the scheme because Leonard was a professional predator. Leonard knew exactly how to draft a legally binding property transfer that would strip me of my rights. They planned to steal my 3 acres of prime commercial real estate under the guise of protecting me from imaginary debt collectors. They intended to flip the land to a corporate developer for a massive payout and leave me to rot in a cheap state-run facility. The sheer magnitude of their greed was breathtaking. They were willing to destroy my entire life just to cash in on a real estate boom. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought my silence was a sign of weakness, and my simple clothes were proof of my ignorance. I looked down at my rough, calloused hands. These hands had built an empire from nothing. These hands had steered massive trucks through ice storms to make sure deliveries arrived on time. I had spent my entire life outworking, outsmarting, and outlasting my competitors. I was not about to let a cheap real estate flipper and a materialistic fraud steal my legacy. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, letting the plan take shape in my mind. I was not going to throw them out of my house. I was not going to scream or yell or threaten them. Anger is a useless emotion when you are fighting a war. Cold, calculated strategy is what wins battles. I was going to let them believe they were winning. I was going to let Leonard draft his contracts and print his documents. I was going to let Vanessa plan how she would spend the millions she thought she was stealing. I would give them just enough rope to hang themselves completely. Oliver Stanton was already digging into Leonard's financial history. I knew men like Leonard. They drive flashy sports cars and wear expensive cologne, but their businesses are usually built on a fragile foundation of high-interest loans and unpaid contractors. I had a very strong feeling that Leonard was desperate. A man does not try to steal an old man's house unless his own house is currently on fire. If my suspicions were correct, Leonard needed my land to save himself from total financial ruin. And if that was true, I was going to buy his debt. I was going to use my blind trust to purchase every single loan and mortgage holding Leonard's fragile business together. I was going to become his primary creditor. I stood up from my desk and walked back into the living room. The house was quiet and still. I looked at the faded wallpaper and the old brick fireplace. This house held all my memories, but it was also the perfect bait. I would invite them back inside. I would let them sit at my dining table and present their final demands, and when they thought they had me completely cornered, I would show them exactly who they were dealing with. The game was no longer about playing a confused senior. It was about orchestrating the absolute destruction of their predatory empire. I went into the kitchen and poured the rest of the coffee into the sink. I did not feel sad anymore. I did not feel disappointed in my son. I only felt a deep, unwavering focus. The trap was fully constructed, and the predators were marching blindly toward the edge. Oliver Stanton works out of a high-rise building in the center of the financial district. I drove my 12-year-old truck right up to the valet stand the next morning and handed the keys to a young kid in a sharp vest. He looked at my truck like it was a pile of scrap metal, but I just tipped him a $20 bill and told him to park it up front. I walked into the lobby wearing my usual faded jeans and a clean flannel shirt. The people in the elevators wore tailored suits and carried expensive leather briefcases. They looked right through me. They saw an old man who had probably wandered into the wrong building to ask for directions. They had no idea I was on my way to the top floor to authorize a financial execution. The receptionist on the 50th floor asked me if I had an appointment. Her voice dripped with that same polite condescension I was so used to hearing from Vanessa. I just told her to call Oliver Stanton and let him know Jack was here. Less than a minute later, the heavy glass doors swung open and Oliver walked out himself. Oliver is a shark in a tailored suit. He does not smile often, and he does not waste time with pleasantries. He shook my hand firmly and guided me past a dozen junior lawyers who stopped what they were doing to stare at the old man in flannel walking into the senior partner's private office. Oliver poured 2 cups of black coffee and handed me one. We sat down at a massive mahogany desk that overlooked the entire city skyline. I did not waste his time. I laid out the entire situation clearly and methodically. I told him about the cowardly lie my son Aaron had told his wife. I told him about Vanessa bringing her father, Leonard Pierce, to my house with an irrevocable deed of transfer. I explained how they were trying to steal my property under the guise of protecting me from imaginary medical debt. Oliver listened in absolute silence. His face remained perfectly, entirely still. When I finished, he leaned forward and asked me if I wanted him to file a restraining order or send a cease and desist letter to Leonard. I took a slow sip of my coffee and shook my head. I told Oliver that sending a warning letter would only make them scatter like roaches. I told him I did not want to defend my property. I wanted to dismantle their entire operation. I instructed Oliver to keep my name completely out of the public record. I wanted him to use the vast resources from my blind trust to launch a full-scale investigation into Leonard Pierce. I wanted to know every single detail about the man who thought he could steal my home. I wanted to know his weaknesses, his liabilities, and his secrets. I told Oliver to look deep into Leonard's real estate flipping business. I wanted to see his corporate tax returns. I wanted to know who held the mortgages on his commercial properties. I wanted to know his credit score, his outstanding business loans, and exactly how much money he owed to the major banks. I instructed Oliver to hire the best private financial investigators he could find. I gave him full legal authorization to spend whatever it took to unearth every hidden secret Leonard possessed. Oliver finally smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile. He told me he understood perfectly. He said he would have his best people tearing into Leonard's life before I even left the building. I left the law firm and drove back to my quiet suburban neighborhood. The trap was officially set, but the hardest part was just beginning. I had to go back to my house and continue playing the role of a terrified and broken old man. I had to sit in my living room and wait for the predators to come back to the bait. The waiting game requires a very specific kind of emotional discipline. You have to swallow your pride completely. You have to let arrogant people treat you like a fool without ever letting the burning anger show in your eyes. 2 days later, the phone in my kitchen rang. I let it ring 4 times before I picked it up with a slow, shaky hand. It was Vanessa. Her voice was dripping with that fake sugary sweetness she used whenever she wanted something. She asked me how I was feeling today. She asked me if I was taking my expensive medication. Then she casually mentioned the legal paperwork her father had dropped off earlier in the week. She asked me if I had signed the contract yet, so they could finally protect my house from the terrible debt collectors. I kept my voice low and fragile. I told her I was having a lot of trouble reading the small print because my eyes were getting so weak. I told her the legal words confused me and made my head spin. I acted as though I was completely overwhelmed by the burden of my imaginary debt. I heard a small sigh of profound impatience on the other end of the line. Vanessa told me I did not need to understand the legal jargon. She said her father was an expert who was taking care of everything, and all I needed to do was write my name on the dotted line. She told me I was running out of time and that the authorities were going to take my house any day now if I did not cooperate. I thanked her profusely for caring so much about a useless old man like me. I promised her I would try to read the papers again that evening and call her father soon. After she hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the phone. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to scream the truth through the receiver. It was agonizing to listen to her manipulate me using my son's desperate lie as a weapon to steal the land beneath my feet. But I knew that true justice requires absolute patience. I needed to keep her completely comfortable. I needed her to believe she was holding all the winning cards so she would not see the avalanche coming toward her. The rest of the week dragged on at an agonizing pace. I spent my days maintaining my garden and keeping my house perfectly clean. Occasionally, I would see a slow-moving car drive past my house. Sometimes it was a sleek black sedan. Sometimes it was a silver sports car. I knew Leonard was sending people to check on me. He was making sure I had not packed my bags and run away. He was making sure the property was still sitting there waiting for him to steal it. I made sure to sit on my front porch in my worn-out clothes looking lost and entirely defeated, so his scouts could report back that the prey was secure and unsuspecting. On Thursday afternoon, I received another phone call. This time it was my son, Aaron. He sounded incredibly nervous. He stammered and tripped over his words. He asked me if everything was okay at the house. He asked me if Vanessa or her father had been bothering me lately. I knew Aaron was completely in the dark about the real estate scheme. He just wanted to make sure I was still playing along with his medical debt lie to keep his marriage intact. I kept my answers short and vague. I told him I was fine. I told him I was handling things on my own. I did not mention Leonard. I did not mention the predatory contract sitting on my dining room table. Aaron was too cowardly to ask direct questions, so he accepted my vague answers and quickly hung up the phone. He was so desperate to avoid conflict that he was perfectly willing to stay blind to the destruction happening right around him. I realized then that I could not save my son from the coming fallout. He had chosen his path when he decided to lie to his wife instead of acting like an honest man. Now he was going to have to face the brutal consequences alongside her. Friday morning finally arrived. I was sitting at my kitchen table drinking my black coffee when my cell phone vibrated. It was a secure message from Oliver Stanton. He told me the preliminary financial investigation was complete. He said his team had found exactly what we were looking for and that the situation was even more desperate than we had anticipated. He asked me to come back to his office on Monday morning to review the documents in person. I replied to Oliver with a simple confirmation. The trap had been successfully laid, and the steel jaws were ready to snap shut. The bait was untouched on the table, and the predators were circling closer and closer, completely blind to the danger. I knew the coming days would require absolute precision. I poured the rest of my coffee into the sink and washed the mug with steady hands. I looked at my reflection in the small mirror by the front door. The tired old man looking back at me was ready to burn a corrupt empire to the absolute ground. I drove downtown early on Monday morning. The city was just waking up. The sky was a pale gray, and the streets were filled with people rushing to their chums. I parked my old truck in the same spot at the valet stand. The young kid recognized me this time and gave me a respectful nod. I walked into the towering glass building and took the elevator straight to the top floor. I did not feel any anxiety or fear. I only felt a cold and absolute focus. I was a man going to work. Oliver Stanton was waiting for me in his private conference room. The large mahogany table was covered in thick stacks of paper and financial records. Oliver stood at the window looking out over the city skyline. When he heard me walk in, he turned around and pointed to a thick black binder sitting in the center of the table. He told me to take a seat. He said his private investigators had spent the entire weekend digging through the dirt of Leonard Pierce. He said what they found was a masterpiece of financial desperation. I sat down and opened the black binder. The first page was a summary of Leonard corporate holdings. To the outside world, Leonard projected the image of a highly successful real estate tycoon. He drove a flashy silver sports car and wore expensive tailored suits. He talked loudly about his investments and threw cash around at fancy restaurants. But the papers in front of me told a completely different story. Leonard was not a tycoon. I was a desperate man balancing on a tightrope of toxic debt. Oliver sat across from me and laid out the brutal truth. Leonard had built his entire business model on high-interest commercial loans. For years, he had been buying distressed properties and flipping them for a quick profit. But the real estate market had shifted, and Leonard had made several massive miscalculations. He had purchased 4 large commercial buildings on the east side of the city. He took out predatory loans to fund the renovations, hoping to secure high-paying corporate tenants. But the tenants never came. The buildings sat completely empty, gathering dust and generating absolutely zero revenue. Oliver pointed to a spreadsheet filled with red ink. He explained that Leonard was burning through cash every single month just to pay the interest on his massive loans. His creditors were losing patience. The banks had already sent multiple warnings, and the private lenders were preparing to foreclose on his entire portfolio. Leonard was less than 30 days away from total financial ruin. His flashy lifestyle was a complete illusion. He was completely broke and staring down the barrel of total bankruptcy. I looked at the numbers and let the reality sink in. This was the man who had sat at my dining table pretending to be a generous savior. This was the man who had looked me in the eye and offered to protect my house from imaginary debt collectors. He was not trying to save my family. He was trying to save himself. My 3 acres of prime commercial real estate were his absolute last hope. Oliver pulled out a second stack of documents. These papers outlined exactly how Leonard planned to use my land. The city council had recently rezoned my suburban neighborhood for high-density commercial development. The soil beneath my quiet home was suddenly worth millions. Leonard knew that if he could convince me to sign over the deed to his private holding company, he could immediately use my land as collateral. He planned to take my property to the bank and secure a massive commercial loan. That loan would give him enough cash to pay off his predatory lenders and save his failing business. I was going to use my life savings to bail out his own sinking ship. And once he secured the loan, he would sell my land to a corporate developer for a massive payout. I would be thrown out of my home and left with nothing. Leonard would walk away a millionaire, leaving me to rot in some cheap state-run facility. It was a brilliant and utterly ruthless plan. But the most sickening part of the discovery was yet to come. Oliver slid a printed transcript across the table. He told me his investigators had managed to acquire a series of emails and text messages between Leonard and his daughter Vanessa. I picked up the pages and read the words my daughter-in-law had written. My stomach turned to ice. Vanessa was not an innocent bystander in her father's scheme. She was the architect. The emails revealed a truth so ugly it took my breath away. Vanessa had known about my son's massive credit card debt for months. Aaron thought he was cleverly hiding his financial ruin by pretending my medical bills were draining their accounts. But Vanessa was not stupid. She had checked his credit reports and seen the truth. She knew Aaron was lying about the medical bills. She knew he had spent over $100,000 funding her luxury vacations and designer clothes. But instead of confronting her husband or filing for divorce, Vanessa saw an opportunity. She realized that Aaron's cowardly lie gave her the perfect weapon. She contacted her father and told him about my property and the recent rezoning laws. In one email, she explicitly told Leonard that I was a lonely, gullible old man who would do anything to save his son. She told her father to use the fake medical debt story to terrorize me into signing over the house. She wrote that Aaron was too weak to ever confess the truth and that I was too naive to fight back. Vanessa struck a deal with her own father. If she helped him secure my property, Leonard agreed to give her a massive cut of the final sale. She planned to use that money to silently wipe out Aaron's credit card debt and keep the rest to fund her extravagant lifestyle. She was perfectly willing to destroy my life, strip me of my home, and throw me into the street just to maintain her illusion of wealth. She was going to let her husband believe his lie had worked while she secretly orchestrated the theft of his entire inheritance. I sat in the quiet conference room and read those emails over and over again. The depth of her cruelty was almost impossible to comprehend. She had sat at my dining table, refused to eat my food, and treated me like absolute garbage while secretly plotting to steal the very roof over my head. She had watched my son cry and beg me to play along with his lie, knowing the whole time that she was using his shame to rob me blind. I felt a profound sense of clarity wash over me. For a brief moment, I had felt sorry for my son. I had felt a pang of guilt for letting him trap himself in his own deception. But reading those emails erased any lingering sympathy. Aaron had built a marriage on lies, and he had chosen a partner whose greed knew absolutely no bounds. They deserved each other, and they both deserved exactly what was coming to them. I looked up at Oliver. The corporate attorney was watching me closely, waiting for my reaction. He asked me if I needed a moment to process the information. He asked if I wanted to rethink our strategy and go to the authorities with the evidence of their fraud. I told him I did not want to involve the police. The justice system is slow, and punishments are often too lenient. I wanted to handle this my own way. I wanted to deliver a consequence so severe and absolute that they would never recover from it. I closed the black binder and placed my hands flat on the mahogany table. I looked Oliver in the eye and gave him his final instructions. I told him to contact the distressed lenders who currently held the mortgages on Leonard empty commercial buildings. I told him to use the funds from my blind trust to purchase every single piece of Leonard debt. I wanted to buy the loans at a premium if necessary. I wanted absolute control over Leonard's financial existence. Oliver's eyes widened slightly before a slow, cold smile spread across his face. He understood exactly what I was doing. By purchasing those predatory loans, I would instantly become Leonard's primary creditor. The man trying to steal my home would suddenly owe me millions of dollars. I would hold the absolute legal right to foreclose on his entire portfolio the moment he missed a payment. And based on Oliver's financial report, Leonard was completely out of cash and guaranteed to default within the week. I told Oliver to move quickly. I wanted the debt purchases finalized and legally binding by the end of the week. I wanted all the paperwork drafted and ready for execution. Oliver assured me he would have his entire team working around the clock to secure the loans. He told me that by Friday afternoon, Jack Callahan would personally own Leonard Pierce. I left the law firm and took the elevator back down to the lobby. The sun was shining bright as I walked out to my old truck. I climbed into the cab and started the engine, listening to the familiar hum of the motor. I drove back to my quiet suburban neighborhood, feeling a deep sense of purpose. I was no longer an old man playing a victim. I was an architect building a very precise cage. When I arrived home, I walked through my front door and looked around the living room. Everything was exactly as I had left it. The house was peaceful and still. I went into the kitchen and made a fresh pot of coffee. I knew the coming days would be filled with tension. Vanessa and Leonard would continue their pressure campaign. They would push harder, believing I was cracking under the weight of the imaginary debt collectors. I was ready for them. I would play my part flawlessly. I would tremble when they called. I would act confused and frightened. I would let them believe their cruel and pathetic scheme was working perfectly. Because the higher they climbed, the harder the fall would be. They thought they had found a vulnerable target, but they had actually kicked a sleeping giant. The financial autopsy was complete, and the execution was officially in motion. The waiting game is always the hardest part of any strategy. When you set a trap, you have to be perfectly comfortable with the silence that follows. You have to sit perfectly still and let the predator convince themselves that they are the ones doing the hunting. I spent the next 3 days in my house, moving through my daily routine with deliberate slowness. I watered the tomatoes in my backyard. I read the morning paper on the porch. I let my old truck sit untouched in the driveway. To anyone watching from the street, I looked like a defeated old man, paralyzed by fear and indecision. But inside the four walls of my home office, I was wide awake and listening to the flashing red light on my answering machine. Vanessa was losing her patience. People who are driven entirely by greed have a very specific weakness. They cannot stand delays. They operate on a constant, frantic energy because their entire lifestyle is built on borrowed time and borrowed money. Leonard needed the deed to my property to save his failing real estate business from total collapse, and Vanessa needed her cut of that money to pay off the massive credit card debt she had accumulated. They thought they had backed me into a corner, but my silence was driving them absolutely crazy. The first voicemail arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was washing my coffee mug in the kitchen sink. I heard the machine click and whir into action. Vanessa did not bother to say hello. Her voice echoed through the quiet house, dripping with aggressive impatience. She demanded to know why I had not called her father back. She said she knew I was sitting at home doing nothing and accused me of being deliberately difficult. She painted a pathetic picture of my son, claiming that Aaron was physically ill from the stress of carrying my imaginary medical debts. She said my refusal to sign the paperwork was destroying his mental health and tearing their marriage apart. I stood by the sink and listened to her use my son as a human shield. It was a cowardly tactic, but it was exactly what I expected from her. She ended that first message by telling me I was running out of time and that her father was doing me a massive favor that I did not deserve. I walked into the office, pressed a button on the machine, and saved the digital audio file directly to my secure computer drive. I did not return her call. I simply went back to the kitchen and dried my coffee mug. The second voicemail came late Wednesday evening. The tone had shifted entirely. The thin veil of frustration was gone, and in its place was a cold, calculated cruelty. Vanessa told me she had spent her afternoon researching long-term care facilities for indigent seniors. She described these places in graphic, horrifying detail. She talked about cinder block walls, peeling linoleum floors, and the overwhelming smell of industrial bleach. She told me these state-run facilities were where people went when their families finally gave up on them. She said the nurses were underpaid and overworked, and that residents were often left sitting in dark rooms for days on end with absolutely no visitors. She was trying to break my spirit through sheer terror. I visualized myself locked away in a grim, sterile institution, entirely forgotten by the world. She told me that if I did not sign the deed over to her father by the end of the week, she would personally pack my bags and drop me off at one of these facilities. She said Aaron was too weak to make the hard choices, but she was more than willing to do what was necessary to protect their financial future. She promised me that once I was locked inside a state home, she would never let Aaron visit me again. I sat in my squeaky desk chair and listened to the threat hang in the heavy air of my office. It was a chilling thing to hear a person you welcomed into your family speak to you with such profound malice. She truly believed I was a helpless victim, completely at her mercy. I saved the second audio file, feeling a deep, cold satisfaction settling in my chest. She was handing me the nails for her own coffin. But the final voicemail, the one that sealed her fate, permanently arrived on Thursday afternoon. The desperation in her voice had reached a fever pitch. Leonard must have received another foreclosure warning from his predatory lenders, because Vanessa sounded absolutely frantic. She no longer bothered to hide her intentions behind the fake story of my medical debt. She dropped the act completely and resorted to outright criminal extortion. Vanessa explicitly stated that she was done waiting for me to do the right thing. She told me she had already contacted legal professionals and medical specialists who were friendly with her father. She bragged that Leonard had doctors on his payroll who were ready and willing to sign official documents declaring me legally incompetent. She proudly confessed that they had a coordinated plan to fabricate a medical history proving I suffered from advanced dementia. She said these doctors would swear under oath that I was a danger to myself and incapable of managing my own affairs. She laid out the entire illegal conspiracy with arrogant pride. She told me that once the doctors signed the fake evaluations, a judge would grant her and Aaron full legal guardianship over my life. She promised me that the moment the ink was dry on that court order, she would forcefully evict me from my home, sell the land to her father, and use the money however she saw fit. She ended the recording by giving me a final ultimatum. She said I could sign the deed voluntarily and retain a shred of dignity, or I could wait for the fake doctors to drag me out of my house in a straitjacket. She told me I had 24 hours to make my choice. The machine clicked off. The silence that followed was absolute. I looked at the blinking red light on the console and let out a slow, steady breath. She had done it. She had explicitly confessed to a coordinated criminal conspiracy to commit medical fraud, elder abuse, and property theft, and she had done it on a recorded line. I downloaded the final audio file, attached all 3 voicemails to an encrypted email, and sent them directly to Oliver Stanton. My phone rang less than 5 minutes later. Oliver rarely calls me during his lunch hour, but the sheer magnitude of Vanessa's arrogance had clearly caught his attention. He told me he had listened to the recordings. His voice held a rare tone of dark amusement. He said he had seen a lot of greedy people destroy their own lives in his career, but he had never seen someone practically gift-wrap a federal extortion case and hand it to their primary adversary. Oliver confirmed that the trap was perfectly primed. He told me his team had successfully finalized the purchase of Leonard commercial debt. My blind trust was now the sole owner of every single predatory loan-keeping Leonard real estate business afloat. The paperwork was signed, sealed, and legally binding. I was officially Leonard Pierce's largest and only creditor. If Leonard missed his scheduled payment on Monday morning, I had the absolute legal authority to seize his entire portfolio and bankrupt him instantly. I told Oliver it was time to bring them into the house. I told him I wanted him to be there in person, to witness the look on their faces when the walls finally closed in. Oliver agreed. He said he would prepare the final disclosure documents and drive out to my house tomorrow afternoon. We synchronized our timing down to the minute. I hung up the phone and stared at the dark screen for a long moment. It was time to make the call. I cleared my throat and let my shoulders drop. I practiced the weak, trembling breath I had perfected over the past few weeks. I dialed Leonard's number and waited. He answered on the second ring, his voice booming with fake, cheerful enthusiasm, as though his daughter had not just threatened to throw me into an asylum. I spoke slowly, letting my voice crack with manufactured defeat. I told Leonard that I had thought about his generous offer. I told him the legal papers confused me, but that I just wanted what was best for my son. I acted as though Vanessa's cruel voicemails had successfully broken my spirit. I whispered that I was terrified of the debt collectors and terrified of losing my family. I told him I was ready to surrender the house. Leonard let out a loud, triumphant laugh. He tried to mask his relief, but I could hear the sheer, desperate joy vibrating in his voice. He told me I was making the smartest decision of my life. He praised me for being a good father and sacrificing my pride for Aaron's future. He said he would bring Vanessa with him to celebrate the moment and handle the witness signatures. I told him to come to my house tomorrow afternoon. I said I would have a pot of coffee waiting and the pen ready. Leonard promised they would be there right on time. He hung up the phone, already dreaming about the millions he was going to make off my land. He thought he had just secured the lifeline that would save his fraudulent empire. I thought he had outsmarted a gullible old man. I placed the phone gently on my desk. I stood up and walked into my kitchen. I opened the cabinets and began to pull out my best coffee cups. I wiped down the wooden dining table, making sure the surface was completely spotless. I moved with a calm, steady rhythm, preparing my home for the final act of this miserable play. I looked at my calloused hands resting on the clean wooden table. These hands had steered heavy machinery through freezing rain. These hands had built a massive company through sheer force of will. And tomorrow, these same hands were going to hand a predatory family the exact destruction they had so greedily engineered for me. The long wait was finally over. The predators were coming to dinner, and they had absolutely no idea they were the main course. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across my front porch while I sat in my old wooden rocking chair, quiet hum of the suburban street. I was wearing my most faded pair of jeans and a worn-out flannel shirt with a frayed collar. I wanted to look exactly like the defeated and broken man they expected to see. Inside the house, the coffee pot was brewing, filling the kitchen with a rich, warm scent. Everything was perfectly arranged. I had cleared off the large oak dining table, leaving only 2 plain coffee mugs and a cheap plastic pen resting in the center. I did not want any distractions when the final curtain fell. Right on time, a sleek silver sports car turned onto my street and pulled into my gravel driveway. The tires crunched loudly, breaking the peaceful silence of the afternoon. The engine roared for a brief moment before shutting off. I watched from the porch as the 2 doors swung open. Leonard stepped out first, adjusting the lapels of a sharp, charcoal gray suit that looked far too expensive for a casual Friday afternoon in the suburbs. He ran a hand through his slicked back hair and flashed a bright, artificial smile toward the house. Vanessa stepped out of the passenger side, and her appearance was even more absurd. She was wearing a tailored cream-colored pantsuit with sharp, aggressive lines and a pair of towering heels that immediately sank into my gravel driveway. She let out a heavy sigh of annoyance, pulling her foot free and carefully stepping onto the concrete walkway. She looked around my property, not with the eyes of a guest, but with the cold, calculating gaze of a demolition contractor. She was looking at my grass and my trees, and seeing only concrete parking lots and retail storefronts. I stayed on the porch, observing every tiny detail of their arrival. I noticed the way Leonard checked his reflection in the car window before walking up the path. I noticed the way Vanessa checked her phone, ignoring the world around her. They moved with the arrogant confidence of people who believe they have already won the game. I forced my hands to shake slightly as I stood up, leaning heavily on the wooden porch railing. I gave them a weak, trembling wave as they approached the steps. Leonard bounded up the porch steps with loud, heavy footsteps. He did not wait for me to invite him inside. He reached out and grabbed my hand, shaking it with a firm, overpowering grip that was designed to make me feel small and weak. He clapped me on the shoulder and marched right through my front door, acting as though he already owned the place. Vanessa followed closely behind him. She did not bother to greet me. She stopped at the welcome mat, wiped her expensive shoes with exaggerated disgust, and stepped into my hallway. She looked at the framed family photos on the walls and the old rug under her feet with an expression of pure contempt. She ran her manicured finger along the edge of my hall table, checking for dust. She was treating my home like a condemned building ready for the wrecking ball. I closed the front door silently behind them and shuffled into the kitchen, dragging my feet across the floorboards. I poured the coffee with shaking hands intentionally spilling a few drops on the counter to sell the illusion of my declining motor skills. When I walked into the dining room, Leonard had already taken the seat at the head of the table. Vanessa sat next to him, crossing her arms and checking her watch, as if she had much more important places to be. She told me to hurry up because they had a reservation at a high-end restaurant downtown to celebrate. She did not even try to hide her eagerness to strip me of everything I owned. She spoke to me slowly and loudly, enunciating every single word as if my brain was too damaged to comprehend normal human speech. Leonard unlatched his heavy leather briefcase, and the sound echoed loudly in the quiet room. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy premium paper. He slapped the stack down on the center of my wooden table with a loud, sharp smack. He slid the papers toward me, tapping the top page with his heavy gold pen. He told me he had prepared everything perfectly to ensure my total protection from the medical debt collectors. The document on top was not just a simple property transfer. It was a comprehensive and predatory power of attorney contract. If I signed that piece of paper, I would be legally handing Leonard the absolute right to control my bank accounts, my healthcare decisions, and every single asset I possessed. He was not just trying to steal my land. He was trying to erase my legal existence entirely. Leonard pointed his pen at the signature lines, explaining that this contract was necessary so he could fight the hospital lawyers on my behalf without bothering me with the stressful details. He spun a beautiful lie about taking the heavy burden off my tired shoulders. The second document was the irrevocable deed of transfer for the house and the 3 acres of land. He promised me verbally that I could live in the spare bedroom of the house until the end of my days, completely omitting the fact that the contract explicitly gave him the right to evict me with 0 notice. Vanessa leaned forward and offered a cold, patronizing smile. She told me I was doing the right thing for Aaron. She said Aaron was so relieved that I was finally taking responsibility for my burdens and making sure their future was secure. She lied straight to my face, using my son as the ultimate weapon to force my hand. I looked at the papers, and then I looked at the 2 predators sitting in my home, completely unaware that the trap was about to spring shut. I reached into the front pocket of my faded flannel shirt and slowly pulled out my reading glasses. I let my fingers fumble with the plastic frames, making sure they watched me struggle with the simple task. I pushed the glasses up the bridge of my nose and leaned over the thick stack of legal documents. My breathing was deliberately shallow and ragged. I wanted to sound like a man who was entirely overwhelmed by the weight of the world. Leonard sat perfectly still at the head of the table. He was leaning forward just a fraction of an inch, like a starving dog waiting for a scrap of meat to fall to the floor. I picked up the heavy gold pen he had placed in front of me. I held it with a loose, clumsy grip. I let the tip of the pen hover just an inch above the signature line. The silence in my dining room was incredibly heavy. The only sound was the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. I moved the pen closer to the paper, letting my hand shake. I made the gold tip rattle slightly against the wooden table. I looked up at Leonard through the thick lenses of my reading glasses. I told him the words on the page were blurring together. I whispered that I was just so tired of fighting, and that I did not understand all the legal terms he had written down. Vanessa let out a sharp, dramatic groan that echoed loudly in the quiet room. She threw her hands up in the air and rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck in the back of her head. She could not maintain her fake sympathy for another second. The facade of the caring daughter-in-law completely shattered right there in my dining room. She slammed her hand down on the table, making the coffee mugs rattle. She leaned across the table and glared at me with absolute unmasked disgust. She told me to stop whining and just sign the paper. Her voice was sharp and venomous, without a single trace of compassion. She said I was dragging this out just to get attention because I was a lonely, pathetic man. She told me that Aaron was losing sleep every single night, working himself into an early grave because of my massive medical bills. She looked me dead in the eye and said I was nothing but a penniless burden dragging her husband down into poverty. She did not stop there. She leaned in closer, her voice dripping with pure malice. She told me this contract was the only way I could ever repay them for the miserable life I had forced upon them. She actually smiled, a cold, twisted smile when she said it. She said signing my home away was for my own good, because I was completely incapable of taking care of myself. She told me I should be on my knees, thanking her father for stepping in to clean up the pathetic mess of my life. She said if I really loved my son, I would sign the paper and quietly disappear into a state facility where I belonged. She said I had absolutely nothing left to offer the world anyway, and that I was just taking up space that belonged to successful people. She told me I was entirely useless. I let her harsh words hang in the quiet air of my home. I listened to the echo of her cry, bouncing off the walls of the dining room where I had raised my son, where I had taught him how to read, and where I had tried to teach him how to be a good man. I looked at her perfectly manicured nails resting on my oak table. I looked at the smug, arrogant grin on Leonard's face. He did not correct his daughter. He did not ask her to show a little respect to an elder. He just tapped his finger on the contract, urging me to finish the job and give him my land. They truly believed I was a broken and helpless old fool. They thought they had backed a dying animal into a corner. They thought I was absolutely terrified of them, but they were wrong. The performance was officially over. I took a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs completely. The ragged, shallow breathing I had faked for weeks completely disappeared. I sat back in my wooden chair, my shoulders straightened out, and my spine aligned. The weak trembling in my hands vanished in an instant. I held my hands perfectly still, holding the heavy gold pen with a firm and absolute grip. I looked at Vanessa, and then I looked at Leonard. I took off my reading glasses, folded them neatly, and placed them slowly on the table. The scared, confused look in my eyes dissolved, leaving only a cold, calculating focus. I put the gold pen down on the table. It made a sharp, metallic click against the wood. I did not sign a single letter. I simply folded my hands together, rested them on the table, and stared at them. Leonard frowned. The triumphant smile slipped off his face, replacing it with a look of deep confusion. He asked me what I was doing. He told me the debt collectors were not going to wait forever, and that I needed to sign the paperwork immediately to save my son. I did not answer him. I just sat there looking at him the exact way a corporate executive looks at a junior employee who has just made a career-ending mistake. Vanessa started to raise her voice again. She demanded to know why I had put the pen down. She called me a stubborn old fool. She told me I was ruining everything and that she would call the authorities herself to have me dragged away. I let her yell. I did not raise my voice or react to her insults. I knew exactly what was about to happen. I had orchestrated this exact moment down to the very last second. Right! As Vanessa was taking a deep breath to scream another terrible insult. The sound of heavy, confident footsteps echoed on my front porch. The heavy deadbolt on my front door clicked loudly. I had left the door unlocked on purpose specifically for this moment. The wooden door swung wide open and hit the wall with a solid, heavy thud. Leonard jumped in his seat, spilling a few drops of cold coffee onto his expensive suit. Vanessa spun around in her chair, her eyes wide with shock and pure confusion. Neither of them had expected company. They thought they had me completely isolated and trapped. Oliver Stanton walked right into my hallway. He did not knock. He did not ask for permission. He moved with the aggressive, powerful stride of a man who owned the entire building. I was wearing a dark, immaculate tailored suit that made Leonard's expensive clothes look cheap and pathetic in comparison. Oliver did not say a word as he walked through the living room and stepped into my dining room. He looked at Vanessa and Leonard with absolute clinical indifference. They were not people to him. They were just financial obstacles waiting to be completely removed. Oliver walked directly to the head of the table. He stood right next to Leonard, who was now staring up at him with a mix of anger and growing undeniable panic. Oliver was carrying a massive black leather briefcase. It looked incredibly heavy, packed with files and financial records. He lifted the briefcase and dropped it right onto the center of my dining table. It hit the wood with a loud, booming thud that made Vanessa flinch backward in her chair. The heavy briefcase landed directly on top of Leonard's predatory power of attorney contract, completely covering the fraudulent paperwork. Oliver looked down at Leonard and told him he was sitting in his client chair. Leonard sputtered, trying to find his voice. He stood up, puffing his chest out, trying to regain control of the room. He asked Oliver who he thought he was and what he was doing, barging into a private family meeting. Leonard tried to sound intimidating, but his voice shook just a little bit. He was a small-time real estate flipper who preyed on vulnerable people, and he was standing face-to-face with one of the most ruthless corporate attorneys in the entire state. Oliver did not even blink. He calmly unlatched the heavy brass locks on his briefcase. They snapped open with a sharp, piercing sound that echoed in the silent room. Oliver looked at Leonard, and told him that this was no longer a family meeting. He said that it was an eviction. I sat quietly at the other end of the table watching the panic slowly wash over Vanessa's face. She looked from Oliver to me and back to Oliver again. Her brain was desperately trying to process why a high-powered corporate lawyer was standing in the dining room of her supposedly broke and penniless father-in-law. She looked at my steady hands and my straight posture. The illusion was completely shattered. The trap had officially sprung shut. The real game was finally starting, and they had absolutely no idea how badly they had already lost. I looked directly into Leonard's eyes and told him to sit down. My voice was no longer the weak, trembling whisper of an old man begging for mercy. It was cold, hard, and sharp as a razor. It was the voice of a man who had commanded boardrooms, negotiated massive union contracts, and built a regional logistics empire from the ground up. I felt the physical relief of dropping the pathetic act I had maintained for 18 months. I let my shoulders pull back, pulling my spine into perfect alignment. I stopped the artificial shaking in my hands and rested them flat and steady against the warm oak wood of my dining table. Leonard froze halfway out of his chair. He looked at me as if a ghost had just possessed my physical body. His brain was struggling to process the sudden extreme shift in my demeanor. Vanessa stared at my face, trying to comprehend why her fragile father-in-law was suddenly speaking with the heavy, crushing authority of a judge handing down a final, unappealable sentence. I told them both to keep their mouths shut and open their ears because I was only going to explain the reality of their disastrous situation one single time. I told Vanessa that her pathetic, exhausting performance was officially over and that the time for brutal consequences had finally arrived. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, and let the heavy, terrifying silence fill the entire room. I told them I knew absolutely everything about their miserable little scheme. I told them I knew about Aaron lying to cover his massive, suffocating credit card debt. I told them I knew about Vanessa using that desperate lie to terrorize me and isolate me from my own son. I told them I knew about the fake doctors and the cruel, vicious threats of locking me away in a state-run nursing home. Vanessa opened her mouth to speak, her face twisting into a mask of indignant rage, but I slammed my hand flat against the heavy oak table. The sound cracked through the dining room like a gunshot, making her physically jump backward in her chair. I told her I did not give her permission to speak in my home ever again. Oliver Stanton stood at the head of the table, opening his massive leather briefcase with slow, deliberate precision. He pulled out a thick, heavy stack of financial documents printed on bright white paper and began dealing them across the table like a card dealer passing out a guaranteed losing hand. He slid the first heavy packet directly in front of Leonard. Oliver told Leonard that he was looking at a comprehensive forensic audit of his entire real estate flipping business. He told him that our private investigators had spent the last several days looking deep into his commercial holdings, his tax returns, and his outstanding liabilities. Oliver did not use complex legal terms to soften the blow. He spoke plainly and ruthlessly, stripping away Leonard's entire facade. He told Leonard that we knew all about the 4 large commercial buildings on the east side of the city. He told him we knew those buildings were completely empty, gathering dust and generating absolutely zero revenue for the past 3 years. He told him we knew about the massive high-interest mezzanine loans he had taken out to fund those empty properties and how he had cross-collateralized his own personal home just to keep the lights on. Leonard started to sweat heavily. I could see small, clear beads of moisture forming along his hairline and dripping down his forehead. He tried to puff out his chest and act arrogant, telling Oliver that his business finances were private, highly profitable, and none of our concern. Oliver did not even blink at the weak attempt at bravado. He slid another sheet of crisp white paper across the wood, tapping the center of the page with his index finger. He told Leonard that the paper was a drafted copy of his own impending bankruptcy filings. He told him we knew he was bleeding cash every single month just to cover the massive, suffocating interest payments. He told him his predatory lenders were already preparing to foreclose on his entire portfolio within the next 30 days, leaving him with absolutely nothing. Leonard stared at the paper, and all the artificial, confident color drained completely from his face. His expensive spray tan suddenly looked sickly and pale against his skin. He realized we knew exactly how desperate and completely broke he truly was. Oliver then turned his cold, clinical attention to Vanessa. He slid a different, brightly colored folder across the table and placed it right in front of her perfectly manicured hands. He told her to look at the official city zoning records and the certified commercial appraisal of my property. I watched Vanessa look down at the heavy pages. I told her I knew exactly why she had brought her slippery father to my house in the first place. I told her I knew she had been scouring public city registries and had discovered the recent lucrative rezoning laws passed by the local council. I explained to Leonard that I knew he desperately needed my 3 acres of prime commercial real estate to secure a massive corporate loan to save his sinking business. I told them I knew they planned to use my land as collateral to bail out their pathetic financial failures and then sell my property to the highest corporate bidder, leaving me homeless and destitute. Vanessa looked at the official appraisal document. Her eyes widened to the size of saucers as she saw the true staggering value of the dirt beneath her expensive designer shoes. She saw the numbers printed in bold black ink, confirming that the quiet suburban lot was worth millions upon millions of dollars to commercial developers. Her ingrained greed fought a desperate losing battle against her growing panic. She realized that the broke old man she had been tormenting for 18 months was actually sitting on a literal fortune. She tried to stammer out a weak, pathetic excuse claiming they just wanted to help me manage my complicated assets so I would not be taken advantage of by greedy developers in my old age. I looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. I told her she was the only greedy developer I needed protection from, and that her lies were insulting to my intelligence. Oliver reached back into his briefcase and pulled out a small black digital audio player. He placed it carefully on the table next to the stack of financial ruin. He told Vanessa that my home office had a very reliable and very legal answering machine. He pressed a silver button on the device and Vanessa's own voice filled the quiet dining room. The recording played her cold, cruel threats in perfect high-definition audio. We all sat in absolute silence and listened to her brag about having corrupt doctors on her father's payroll ready to sign fake legal documents, declaring me legally incompetent. We listened to her threaten to lock me away in a sterile cinder-block nursing home where no one would ever visit me again. We listened to her promise to drag me out of my house in a straitjacket if I did not sign my property over to her father immediately. The sound of her own malice echoing back at her completely destroyed any remaining illusion of her innocence or good intentions. Vanessa shrunk back into her chair, covering her mouth with her trembling hand. She looked at her father, begging him silently to do something to fix the terrifying situation. But Leonard was completely paralyzed, staring blankly at his own financial death warrants spread across the oak table. I told Vanessa that her voicemails were more than just cruel insults from an angry daughter-in-law. Oliver explained to her with chilling calmness that she had explicitly confessed to a coordinated criminal conspiracy to commit medical fraud, elder abuse, and grand property theft. He told her that handing those recordings over to the state authorities would guarantee her a very long and very unpleasant stay in a federal prison. Vanessa began to cry, but they were not tears of genuine remorse or guilt. They were the desperate, panicked tears of a predator, caught firmly and inescapably in a steel trap. I leaned back in my wooden chair and folded my hands together, resting them against my chest. I told them it was finally time for them to learn exactly who they had tried to rob and destroy. I explained that 10 years ago I had sold my regional logistics company to a massive national conglomerate for $18 million. I watched their jaws physically drop open as the magnitude of my actual wealth finally registered in their greedy, calculating minds. I told them I had placed the entire fortune into a highly secure blind trust managed by top-tier financial advisors who multiplied my wealth every single year. I told them I had chosen to live simply in my quiet suburban home because I valued peace, character, and quiet stability over flashy sports cars and empty, meaningless status symbols. I told them I could have bought and sold their entire miserable lives 10 times over without even checking my bank balance or breaking a sweat. I told them they had brought a knife to a gunfight, and they had completely underestimated the man sitting across from them. Then I delivered the final devastating blow that would end their reign of terror forever. I nodded slowly to Oliver, and he pulled one last solitary document from his briefcase. It was printed on heavy legal paper and embossed with official banking seals and notary stamps. Oliver slid the document to the very center of the table right between Leonard and Vanessa. I told Leonard to read the name of the holding company that now owned every single piece of his commercial debt. Leonard's hands were shaking violently as he picked up the paper. His eyes darted back and forth across the dense legal text, trying to find a loophole or an escape route. He dropped the paper as if it had physically burned his fingers. He looked at me with an expression of sheer, absolute terror that I will never forget for the rest of my life. I told Leonard that when I learned about his failing real estate business and his predatory intentions, I instructed my blind trust to purchase his toxic loans. I told him I had paid a heavy premium to buy out his original lenders in a completely private transaction. I told him that the paperwork was fully executed, legally binding, and completely irreversible by any court in the state. I looked deep into his panicked, sweating eyes and told him that Jack Callahan was now his primary and only creditor. I told him that I personally owned the debt on his empty commercial buildings, his flashy silver sports car, and the very house he slept in every single night. I told him that he did not hold any power over me, but that I held his entire financial existence in the palm of my rough, calloused hand. I told him that his future, his legacy, and his freedom belonged entirely to me. The silence that followed was the most beautiful, peaceful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Leonard was breathing heavily, his chest heaving up and down as the reality of his total destruction crushed the air out of his lungs. Vanessa was sobbing openly, her perfect, expensive makeup running down her face in dark, messy streaks. She looked at me and finally understood that the frail, broke old man she had abused and humiliated was actually the absolute master of her family financial survival. She realized that by trying to steal my home out of pure greed, she had handed me the keys to everything her father owned and ruined her own life in the process. I did not offer them any sympathy. I did not offer them a way out or a chance to negotiate. I sat up straight and delivered my final, inescapable ultimatum. I told Leonard that his next massive loan payment was due on Monday morning at exactly 8 o'clock. I told him I knew for an absolute fact that he did not have the cash to make that payment. I told him that the very second he defaulted on that loan, I was going to instruct Oliver to initiate total, rapid foreclosure on his entire portfolio. I promised him I would seize his empty buildings, I would seize his personal bank accounts, and I would completely liquidate his fraudulent empire down to the last penny. I pointed my finger directly at my front door. I told Leonard and Vanessa to get out of my house immediately. I told them if they ever set foot on my property again, or if they ever tried to contact me or my son, I would not only bankrupt them by Monday, but I would hand the extortion recordings directly to the federal prosecutor and press maximum charges. I told them they had exactly 1 minute to take their pathetic contracts, their fake sympathy, and their ruined lives and walk out my door before I called the police and had them arrested for criminal trespassing. Leonard scrambled out of his chair. His expensive suit deeply wrinkled and his massive pride entirely shattered. He grabbed his heavy leather briefcase and shoved his fraudulent documents inside with shaking, uncoordinated hands, leaving behind the papers Oliver had distributed. He did not say a single word. He was completely defeated, a broken, pathetic man running from a battle he never had a chance of winning. Vanessa stood up, stumbling slightly on her towering high heels. She looked at me one last time, her face drained of all color, her arrogant superiority replaced entirely by crushing, inescapable fear. She turned and practically ran down the hallway, following her father out the front door without looking back. I listened to the heavy wooden door slam shut behind them. I heard the engine of the silver sports car roar to life, and the tires spin wildly against the gravel as they sped away from my property forever. I sat at my dining table and looked at Oliver Stanton. The corporate shark gave me a slow, respectful nod and began packing up his own briefcase in quiet satisfaction. The air in my home felt clean and fresh. The oppressive weight of their greed and malice was completely gone forever. I had not just defended my home from thieves. I had dismantled the people who tried to take it from me, and I had done it with the cold, ruthless precision they completely failed to anticipate. The sound of the silver sports car revving in my driveway was suddenly cut short by the sharp screech of tires. I walked out onto my front porch and looked down at the gravel. Aaron's modest sedan had just pulled into the driveway, completely blocking Leonard's flashy car from backing out into the street. I had sent Aaron a text message an hour ago telling him to come to the house immediately because it was a matter of absolute life and death. I just did not specify whose life was on the line. Aaron stepped out of his car, looking panicked and out of breath. He saw Vanessa standing by the passenger door of her father's car, her face stained with ruined makeup, and her hands shaking. He saw Leonard gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles stark white, trapped in the driveway. Aaron looked up at me, standing tall and perfectly composed on the porch. He asked what was going on and why his wife was crying. I looked down at my son and told him it was time for a family meeting. I pointed to the front door and told them all to get back inside the house. I told Leonard that if he tried to drive over my lawn to escape, I would call Oliver Stanton and have his entire portfolio liquidated before the sun went down. We gathered in my living room. I did not offer anyone a seat. The air was incredibly thick and heavy with tension. Aaron looked around like a terrified child who had just walked into the principal's office. He asked Vanessa why her father was there carrying a heavy leather briefcase. Vanessa could not even look at him. She was staring at the floor, wrapped in her own nightmare, realizing that her entire life was completely falling apart. I looked at Aaron and told him that the pathetic game he had been playing for 18 months was officially over. I told him his wife and his father-in-law had just tried to steal my property, using his cowardly lie as their primary weapon. Aaron's eyes darted wildly around the room. He tried to stammer out a denial, trying to cling to the fake medical debt story one last time. But I cut him off. I raised my voice just enough to command absolute authority. I told Aaron to look at his wife and tell her the absolute truth about his bank accounts. I told him to confess right now, or I would hand all the financial documents over to the authorities and let them sort out the fraud. Aaron collapsed inward. The heavy weight of his deception finally crushed the last bit of fight out of him. He looked at Vanessa, his voice trembling and weak. He admitted that he was completely broke. He confessed that they were drowning in over $100,000 of high-interest credit card debt. He admitted that the luxury vacations, the designer clothes, and the expensive dinners were all financed on borrowed money. Vanessa stood perfectly still, her eyes widening in absolute horror as the words left her husband's mouth. Aaron kept going, the ugly truth spilling out of him like poison from a deep wound. He confessed that I was never sick. He admitted that I did not have a single medical bill and that my health was absolutely perfect. He looked at the floor and admitted that he had made up the entire story about my expensive treatments just to hide his own massive financial failures from her. He said he lied because he was terrified she would leave him if she knew he was just a regular guy who could not afford her extravagant lifestyle. The silence that followed his confession was physically painful. I watched the realization wash over Vanessa's face in real time. You could actually see the exact moment her brain connected all the pieces of this disastrous puzzle. She realized that the broke, sick old man she had been mercilessly torturing and insulting for a year and a half was actually perfectly healthy. She realized that her husband was a complete financial fraud, with zero assets. But the most devastating realization of all was when she remembered what had just happened in my dining room. She remembered the $18 million blind trust. She remembered that I was sitting on a mountain of commercial real estate. She realized that she had just spent the last 18 months burning the only bridge that could have saved her from absolute poverty. Vanessa erupted. It was not a sad, emotional cry. It was a scream of pure, unadulterated fury. She lunged forward and hit Aaron squarely in the chest with both of her hands. She screamed that he was a pathetic, worthless liar. She called him a fraud and a coward. She yelled that she had married him, thinking he had a secure future, thinking he was building a life of status and wealth. She screamed that she had just ruined her father's entire real estate business, trying to secure a future that Aaron had completely faked. Aaron tried to reach for her, crying and begging her to calm down, telling her they could fix it, telling her they could start over. But Vanessa slapped his hands away as if he were carrying a deadly disease. She looked at him with absolute freezing contempt and told him she wanted a divorce. She said she would never spend another day of her life tied to a broke, miserable failure. Then the most pathetic part of the entire afternoon happened. Vanessa suddenly turned away from the husband she had just destroyed and looked directly at me. The venomous anger vanished from her face, completely replaced by a mask of desperate fake victimhood. She took a step toward me, crying fresh tears, holding her hands together, as if she were praying. She told me she did not know the truth. She claimed she was just a victim of Aaron's terrible lies. She said everything she had done was out of sheer panic, because she thought they were losing everything. She begged me to forgive her. She actually had the absolute audacity to suggest that we could put all of this behind us and start over as a real family now that the truth was out. She promised me she could be a good daughter-in-law and that we could manage my vast wealth together. I let out a cold, harsh laugh that stopped her right in her tracks. I looked at her with pure, unfiltered disgust. I reminded her of the cruel voicemails she had left on my answering machine. I reminded her of the threat to lock me away in a cinder-block nursing home and leave me to rot. I reminded her of the corrupt doctors she and her father were planning to use to declare me legally incompetent. I told her that Aaron's lie might have started this mess, but her own malicious greed was what pushed it into outright criminal territory. I told her that she had shown me the absolute rotting darkness of her true soul, and no amount of fake tears would ever erase the malice I had heard in her voice. I told her I would rather burn every single dollar I owned than let her touch a single penny of my legacy. Aaron stopped crying and just stared at his wife in absolute shock. He watched the woman he had gone into massive debt to impress try to instantly abandon him and attach herself to my wealth. He saw her drop him like a piece of garbage the second she realized where the real money was located. The illusion of his perfect, sophisticated wife shattered completely. He finally saw the cold, calculating monster she truly was. He realized that she had never loved him for a single second of their marriage. She only loved the lifestyle he had destroyed himself to provide. I stood by the fireplace and watched their toxic marriage disintegrate into dust right in front of my eyes. This was the inevitable conclusion to a relationship built entirely on lies, greed, and vanity. Aaron fell back to his knees, burying his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. He had sacrificed his dignity, his integrity, and his relationship with his own father just to appease a woman who only loved his imaginary bank balance. He had traded his honor for an illusion, and now the illusion was gone, leaving him with absolutely nothing. I looked down at my son, weeping on the floor of my living room. I remembered the little boy I had taught to ride a bicycle in the driveway. I remembered the young man who used to help me change the oil in my truck. I felt a profound sense of sadness for the boy I had lost, but I did not feel pity for the man sobbing at my feet. I told Aaron that this was the brutal, inescapable cost of cowardice. I told him that when you choose to live a lie, you eventually have to pay the toll, and the toll is always everything you have. I told him he had allowed a greedy, materialistic woman to treat his father like garbage because he was too weak to act like an honest man and tell the truth. I told him he had nobody to blame but himself for the absolute wreckage of his life, and that I was not going to write a check to fix his broken character. I turned my attention back to Leonard and Vanessa. I pointed my finger toward the front door and told them my patience was officially exhausted. I told Leonard that he still had a massive loan payment due to my blind trust on Monday morning, and that he better spend the weekend figuring out how to pack up his empty commercial buildings before I foreclosed on every single brick. Leonard grabbed Vanessa by the arm, pulling her away from her pathetic attempts to beg for my forgiveness. He knew exactly when he was beaten. They did not say another word. They turned and walked out the door, stepping over the ruins of a marriage they had completely destroyed, leaving my son sobbing on the living room floor as the massive, suffocating weight of his own terrible choices finally crushed him into the ground. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, and the silence in my living room was absolute. Aaron was still kneeling on the hardwood floor with his face buried in his hands. He was crying the heavy, ragged tears of a man who had just watched his entire universe collapse. I stood by the fireplace and looked down at my son. I did not offer him a hand to help him up. I did not tell him that everything was going to be all right, because nothing was going to be all right for a very long time. I told Aaron to stand up. I told him that crying on my floor was not going to pay his massive credit card debt, and it was certainly not going to bring his wife back. Aaron slowly pushed himself off the floor. His eyes were red and swollen. He looked at me with a desperate, pleading expression, hoping that I would suddenly soften and offer him a financial lifeline. He thought that because Vanessa was gone, I would automatically step in to fix the mess. I walked over to the front door and opened it. I told my son to go home. I told him he needed to face the reality of the life he had built. Aaron walked out to his modest sedan with his shoulders slumped. He looked back at me one last time before getting into the car. I closed the door, locking the deadbolt with a solid final click. Oliver Stanton was still standing in my dining room. He had packed his massive leather briefcase and was waiting patiently. He gave me a slow, respectful nod. I told Oliver that the weekend was going to be very quiet, but Monday morning was going to be a bloodbath. Oliver agreed. He promised me he would be sitting at his desk at exactly 7 in the morning, waiting for the clock to strike 8. He walked out the back door and drove away, leaving me entirely alone in my quiet, paid-off suburban home. I spent Saturday and Sunday doing exactly what I always do. I drank my black coffee on the front porch. I trimmed the hedges in my backyard. I listened to the birds singing in the old oak trees. My phone rang a few times, but I let it go straight to voicemail. I did not need to hear from Aaron, and I certainly did not need to hear from Leonard. The trap had already snapped shut. The only thing left to do was collect the pelts. Monday morning arrived with a clear blue sky. I sat at my kitchen table watching the clock on the wall. The second hand ticked past 8 in the morning. My cell phone rang exactly 2 minutes later. It was Oliver. His voice was incredibly calm and perfectly cold. He told me that Leonard Pierce had failed to make the scheduled payment to my blind trust. He said Leonard had frantically tried to wire a tiny fraction of the required amount, but the transaction bounced due to insufficient funds. Leonard was officially and legally in total default. I did not hesitate for a single second. I gave Oliver the green light. I told him to execute the absolute maximum penalty allowed by the contracts. I told him to pull the trigger on the foreclosure and burn Leonard real estate business straight to the ground. The purge was swift and completely ruthless. Oliver unleashed a team of corporate litigators who moved with terrifying speed. By noon on Monday, official court orders were filed in the county courthouse. By Tuesday morning, teams of locksmiths, escorted by local sheriffs, arrived at Leonard 4 massive empty commercial buildings on the east side of the city. They drilled out the old locks and secured the properties under the name of my holding company. Leonard tried to file an emergency injunction to stop the bleeding, but the judge threw it out immediately. The contracts Leonard had signed with his original predatory lenders were ironclad, and I had purchased those exact contracts. He had absolutely zero legal ground to stand on. The financial dominoes began to fall one after another. Because Leonard had cross-collateralized his personal assets to keep his business afloat, the destruction spread directly into his personal life. The bank froze his checking and savings accounts. The leasing company sent a repo man to a downtown restaurant and dragged his shiny silver sports car onto the back of a flatbed tow truck while he was eating lunch. Within 48 hours, Leonard Pierce went from pretending to be a wealthy real estate tycoon to a man who could not even afford to buy a cup of coffee. His arrogant strut was entirely gone. His fake empire was officially liquidated and absorbed into my blind trust. The absolute collapse of Leonard finances triggered the immediate and permanent exit of his daughter. Vanessa had spent her entire life relying on the illusion of wealth. When she walked out of my house on Friday afternoon, she had assumed she could run back to her father and use his money to escape the massive hole she had dug with Aaron. She thought Leonard would easily bounce back and fund her next luxury vacation. But when she woke up on Tuesday morning and realized her father was completely bankrupt, the reality of her situation finally set in. Vanessa was completely broke. Her husband was drowning in $100,000 of high-interest debt, and the father she relied on was facing total financial ruin. I heard the details of her departure a few days later. Vanessa did not shed a single tear for her ruined marriage. She did not sit down with Aaron to discuss a payment plan or figure out how they could rebuild their lives together. The very second she realized there was no money left to extract from my family, she packed her expensive designer clothes into her matching luxury suitcases. She called a cab and walked out the front door of their leased house while Aaron was sitting on the living room sofa. She left her wedding ring sitting on the kitchen counter, right next to the towering stack of unpaid credit card bills and final notice envelopes. She abandoned him without a single word of apology. She simply vanished, moving to another state to find a brand new victim who could afford to fund her vanity. Aaron was left completely alone in a massive, expensive house he could not afford. The fake medical debt he had constructed to protect his ego had ultimately destroyed everything he valued. He was forced to face the brutal, cold reality of his choices, without the shield of a wealthy wife or the safety net of a forgiving father. The collections agencies did not care about his broken heart. The credit card companies filed aggressive lawsuits against him, demanding immediate payment. The landlord of his luxury rental property served him with a 30-day eviction notice. Aaron was staring down the barrel of personal bankruptcy and a completely ruined credit score. 2 weeks after the confrontation in my dining room, Aaron called me. His voice was hollow and completely drained of energy. He sounded like a man who had not slept in days. He told me the repo men had come in the middle of the night and towed away his car. He told me he was packing his belongings into cardboard boxes because he had to vacate the rental house by the end of the week. He hesitated for a long time before asking the question I knew was coming. He asked me for a loan. He begged me to lend him just enough money from my blind trust to rent a cheap apartment and buy a used car so he could get to work. He swore he would pay me back every single penny with interest. He promised he had learned his lesson and that he would never lie to me again. I sat on my front porch, holding the phone to my ear. I listened to the desperate, pleading voice of the boy I had raised. Every paternal instinct in my body screamed at me to write him a check. It would have cost me absolutely nothing. The amount of money he needed was a microscopic drop in the bucket compared to the wealth sitting in my trust accounts. I could have solved all of his problems with a single phone call to my bank. I could have bought him a house and a car and wiped out his debt in an instant. But I knew that if I bailed him out, I would be robbing him of the most important lesson a man can ever learn. I knew that rescuing him would only teach him that he could lie, cheat, and betray his family without ever facing permanent consequences. I took a slow, deep breath and looked out at my quiet, peaceful neighborhood. I told Aaron no. I told him that I loved him, but I was not going to give him a single dollar. I told him that he had built a mountain of debt to impress a woman who despised his father, and now he had to climb his way out of that mountain with his own two bare hands. I told Aaron to take the bus to work. I told him to rent a small room in a cheap boarding house. I told him to work overtime and pay down his debts penny by penny until he finally understood the true value of hard, honest work. I told him that character is not built in luxury restaurants or expensive leased cars. Character is built in the dirt when you have absolutely nothing left but your own two hands and your will to survive. Aaron cried softly on the phone, but he did not argue with me. He knew I was right. He knew he had to walk this path entirely alone. He thanked me for telling me the truth and hung up the phone. I put my phone back in my pocket and leaned back in my wooden rocking chair. The storm had finally passed, and the sky was clear. The predators who had tried to steal my home and my legacy were completely dismantled and removed from my life forever. The son who had betrayed my trust was finally walking the long, difficult road to redemption. I sat on my porch and drank my black coffee knowing that my empire and my dignity remained perfectly intact. The sun comes up over the quiet suburban street, casting long shadows across the dew on my front lawn. I am sitting in my old wooden rocking chair, a chipped ceramic mug resting in my calloused hands. The coffee is black, strong, and bitter, just the way I have brewed it every single morning for the last 40 years. The neighborhood is completely silent, save for the occasional chirping of the birds in the old oak trees. My 12-year-old truck sits reliably in the gravel driveway. Looking at my house from the street, absolutely nothing has changed. I am still just an old man in a faded flannel shirt watching the world wake up. But the air in my lungs feels entirely different today. It feels clean. It feels completely free of the toxic, suffocating weight that had been pressing down on my family for the past year and a half. I take a slow sip of my coffee and let the deep, profound peace wash over me. I did not just defend my bank accounts and my physical property. I performed a necessary surgical extraction. I purged the parasites from my life permanently and entirely. Vanessa and Leonard had looked at me and seen a weak, vulnerable Mark. They saw an old fool they could easily manipulate and discard like trash. They measured my worth by the frayed collar of my shirt and the peeling paint on my front porch. They never bothered to look deeper, because people consumed by their own vanity are always completely blind to true strength. They thought my silence was submission. They never realized it was the calm, quiet patience of a man watching a trap perfectly close. I do not feel a single ounce of guilt for the absolute destruction of Leonard predatory real estate business. I do not lose any sleep over Vanessa packing her designer bags and fleeing to another state with absolutely nothing to her name. They were the architects of their own misery. They built a fraudulent empire on a foundation of lies, manipulation, and sheer aggressive greed. I simply removed the fragile support beams and let gravity do the rest of the work. They are entirely gone from my world, banished to the messy, chaotic consequences of their own terrible choices. My home is my sanctuary once again. No one will ever walk through my front door with a fake smile and a predatory contract ever again. My thoughts occasionally drift to Aaron. It is a heavy, difficult thing for a father to watch his only son hit absolute rock bottom. I know he is struggling right now. I know he is waking up in a small, cramped apartment, taking the city bus to work, and facing a mountain of aggressive debt collectors every single day. But I also know that this brutal, unforgiving struggle is exactly what he desperately needs. He had lost his way trying to buy the affection of a woman who only loved his imaginary status. By denying him a financial bailout, I gave him the only gift that actually matters. I gave him the opportunity to rebuild his character from the dirt up. I gave him the chance to finally become a man of substance and integrity. I do not know how long it will take him to climb out of that dark hole, but I will be sitting right here on my porch waiting for the day he can finally look me in the eye with genuine, honest pride. Meanwhile, my legacy remains completely untouchable. The $18 million in my blind trust continues to quietly grow, managed by experts who understand the absolute value of discretion. The 3 acres of prime commercial beneath my house are still firmly legally mine. Corporate developers have already started leaving thick, glossy envelopes in my mailbox, offering ridiculous, staggering sums of cash to buy the lot. I drop their fancy offers straight into the recycling bin. I have instructed Oliver Stanton to politely inform any aggressive buyers that Jack Callahan is not interested in selling his home anytime soon. I have enough money to last 100 lifetimes. I do not need another zero in my bank account. I need my garden, my quiet mornings, and my peace of mind. I lean back in my rocking chair and listen to the familiar creak of the wood. I am exactly where I belong. My dignity is entirely intact, and my empire remains completely invisible to the greedy, desperate eyes of the world. I survived the storm by standing perfectly still and letting the arrogant fools drown in the deep water they dug for themselves. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that true absolute power never actually needs to shout to be heard. Real wealth is not found in leased luxury cars, expensive designer suits, or desperate, frantic attempts to prove your elevated status to complete strangers. True wealth is the quiet, absolute freedom of knowing that nobody owns you and nobody can control your decisions. If you build your relationships on superficial lies and shallow vanity, your entire life will eventually collapse under the crushing weight of the truth. Genuine respect and solid character are earned through hard, honest work, and they are the only real assets that no greedy predator can ever steal from you. If you found value in my story today, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories about standing your ground.